we need to frame issues like the right because it's so effective. But when language games, I feel like a lot of the language that we are thrown even penetrates our psyche. Because even on the show, sometimes when we say Iraq war, I always say, no, occupation, don't use war. Just like little things like that. And now, when we're talking about radical, wow, it's so radical to want health care for everybody, education, living wages, you know, a roof. I mean, that's radical? I mean, but I feel like a lot of people, even on that side, fall prey to this. How do you feel about that, and how is that affecting the gay struggle?
Well, I guess it affects it to some degree. I mean, you know, let's face it, we in the ISO were probably more surprised than others when we woke up to discover that Comrade Obama was a socialist. So clearly the right is rather you know, stealthy in their attempts at using language. I guess I feel that we need to talk to people in language that folks understand. You need to talk directly to people, and you need to, you know, we need to rebuild a left in this country, and that means you need to lead, and sometimes you need to argue with people. There is this ridiculous idea that exists that we have to, you know, some sort of middle-class politesse. We all have to be nice and pleasant, and we should all be nice and pleasant and comradely with each other, but you can also disagree and have an argument with people, because how else are you going to shift their ideas? It's not sufficient to say to people, well, that's another good idea. No, all ideas are not good ideas. There's some bad, crappy, miserable, reactionary ideas, and they need to be taken on. It does not mean then that you slur people or you presume things about them or you attack them. I don't think that's a particularly effective tactic in getting people to change their position by calling them some sort of Luddite or, you know, or whatever, Neanderthal. I think you have to have some, you know, genuine respect with the people that you're having a disagreement with the approach not of denigrating them for having crappy ideas, but actually try to shift their ideas, because people can shift.
Right. And once you get past the soundbite, you realize it's a lot more complicated, because I would meet people and they'd say, oh, I'm against gay marriage, but 15 minutes later I'd find they have a gay brother. Yeah. And maybe they're just not comfortable in the church. But once you get past the soundbite and that reactionary 30-second whatever, depending on what topic it is, you find that it's so much more complicated. And when you're talking about arguing, I mean, think about if the media, people, whatever, TV anchors, whatever, would actually push people on these issues. Because I spent an hour talking to one of the pastors who spearheaded the Yes on 8 campaign. And I said, you know, why, how could you justify $40 million on this when the homeless population in San Francisco has increased 40% in 1 year? How can you justify this? He said, well, it's about the family. Mm-hmm. Because studies show that you will not be a well-rounded person unless you're raised by a mother and father. Now, a mainstream journalist would have said, you know, and I said, wait a minute, my parents got divorced when I was 12, and I host a radio show, I think I'm doing okay, you know? My mom raised me, how can you say that? And he said, well, you're an anomaly. But this conversation, this was the way it went. It was, you know, back and forth. I mean, back and forth. And you're able, maybe not to come to common ground, but at least say it's not so black and white, right? And we have a media that just sort of, that's interesting, Pastor. Next question. I mean, it's just so shallow. So how do you think that, I mean, let's face it, the majority of the people get their news from television. I mean, a lot of the people I met said, look, you guys love your blogs and your magazines. We're working 2 jobs out here. We don't have time for that. We watch the local news and we read the local paper. And they probably won't have a local paper in 2010 because newspapers are taking a dive. It's really sad. But, I mean, you know, we always have these conversations about media and how they affect dialogue. And, you know, what do you think? Because I feel like we're walking in circles on this media conversation.
Yeah, I mean, media affects, but because there's an absence of very much else. I mean, when there aren't movement struggles, because let's face it, I mean, you know, there's, I noticed in the intro to your book, you talk about, you know, you got tired of how, you know, going to these big protests of hundreds of thousands or, you know, millions in the case of like 2003, February 15th, and then it gets ignored by the mainstream media, but people certainly found out about them. And I think when there is active mobilization around issues and people are becoming mobilized, I don't just mean the protests, I mean people themselves becoming self-conscious organizers and and taking these ideas into, to their classmates or to their workmates and into their homes and wherever else that they happen to be, then folks are influenced by these ideas. I mean, let's face it, there's nothing, I went to college in the 80s. My girlfriend and I were the only out lesbians on our campus. The only out lesbians on a campus, and I wasn't going to Mississippi, Ole Miss or something. I was at Northwestern University in Chicago. There were 7,000 or so undergraduates, and it was almost like being in the 1920s speakeasy to go find the lesbian chat thing, okay? This is the 80s. I'm not talking about ancient history here, and maybe it is to some of you, but my hair is much older than the rest of me. But today, I mean, I talk to, young people living in South Central who are part of the Gay-Straight Alliance in their school. I mean, an argument happened. One of those arguments actually was to come out, which I don't think you can moralize at people, because some people clearly cannot come out because of their family situation or work situation, and it is an individual decision whether or not they want to and can. But clearly, the fact that hundreds of thousands, not millions of people are out of the closet today has actually made it easier for others. I mean, in that regard, the right wing is absolutely right about gays. We do recruit. The visible, experience of being able to be around other gay people creates the possibility that perhaps you can diddle a little bit differently. And people get that idea, and that has happened. And that has had an enormous impact on social consciousness around sexuality in this country.
What do you think about strategies now? I mean, what marches are happening on a regular basis. It was great to see people in Fresno shut down the courthouse. I mean, that's where I love watching the marches. It's great that happens in San Francisco, but wow, what's going on in Orange County or Fresno or places like that up north? What do you think about this strategy from here on out, and where should it go?
I mean, I don't have a blueprint, to be honest, but I do think that we need to understand that it cannot just be a legislative. I mean, obviously the law needs to change, and people should get out there. But I'm for approaching I have a slightly different concept of lobbying, perhaps, than the HRC. I think we should lobby with 10,000 or 100,000 of our nearest and dearest friends at the legislative building. I think that's a much more effective conversation to have with your congressperson or senator or what have you. But I also think that it is simply not realistic for us to expect that week in and week out it's just going to be a series of protests that grow ever and ever larger that's going to overturn this. There are going to have to be debates about things around not just gay marriage, but around gay rights generally, around gay liberation. How did we get to this point? Why does homophobia persist in our society? All the kinds of things that you and I have just been talking about, and many, many others. And there's also going to have to be, leafleting campaigns, propaganda, newspapers, organizations in which people actually put out articles to, advance some theoretical understanding about why we're in the situation we're in and how we move forward. If it just becomes every meeting is an organizing meeting to organize the next protest, to be honest, some people will persist, but eventually will flit away, because that is not a sincere strategy of shaping wider opinion. And I think it will also leave it to just kind of the 2010 vote or 2012 or whatever. And I don't think I don't really know that that's necessary. I think we've come to expect that we have to wait for those moments. I mean, there is such a thing. 1953, Eisenhower signed an executive order to remove rights of gays and lesbians. We were kicked out of any possibility of working for the federal government. Why can't Obama be asked to sign an executive order to rescind DOMA? I don't see why not.
Well, what do you think about the pressure he's going to face? Because right now, a number of gay and lesbian groups, I don't remember the URL, but if you do a Google search, the Obama team is in the process of picking the marchers for the inaugural ball, which